Bravo traffic, Oakland 4041 uniform, departing 11 right hand.
Still in the rotor. I had one turn where I was banked up at probably 50 degrees of bank, probably 75 knots. It rolled me to 45 degree bank in the opposite direction. So I was in a left turn to a 45 degree right bank, and then pitched me over to the point where the only thing in my field of view was ground.
This is Soaring the Sky, a glider pilot's podcast, coming to you from the Mid-Atlantic region here in the United States and bringing you great soaring content from glider pilots all over the globe. We now join Chuck and our guest pilot.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. If it's your first time with us, we hope you enjoy this episode and check out our huge library of more great soaring content. A big thank you to our newest Patreon pilot, Michael Majors. We greatly appreciate your support. If you want to help support the podcast so we can continue to grow and keep bringing you more great soaring content, you can click the link in the show notes or go to patreon.com/soaringthesky. You can also see other ways to help us out at soaringthesky.com. We have a great episode lined up for you today. Mitch, our producer, recently ran into Morgan Hall. Now, Morgan had just experienced an amazing uncharted route flying wave in the Sierras. Morgan's family has a deep aviation background that goes all the way back to World War II. So it's not a surprise that he was determined to start his own aviation journey. So listen to this. He traded his computer for an ultralight. That's right. I love this story, but let's let him tell it and join Mitch right now and Morgan for episode 117.
Morgan Hall, welcome to Soaring the Sky.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So got a chance to meet you a few weeks back up at Avenal, and just happened to be the day that you had a pretty crazy wave flight from pretty far west out to the east side of the Sierra in big wave conditions. And I remember everybody was looking at their phones all day, trying to keep track of you and seeing what was going on. And that was really a cool day, I think, for everybody. Long day for you.
Yeah, I was absolutely wiped at the end of that one.
Yeah, and we just barely made the taco place with like 5 minutes to spare before all the food in town was basically we were going to be going to like 7-Eleven or the Mini Mart for nachos or something just a few minutes after. So well, before we get into any of that stuff on your kind of epic flight that day, what we usually do is start off with just having the guest pilot do kind of a brief flyover of their aviation bio and sort of where your aviation journey began for you, and how you got into soaring and all that.
Sure. Happy to talk about that. So I think I have aviation DNA, if that's possible. I think it was passed down. My father's side of the family had aviators in it going back to World War II, bomber trainers, airline executives. My dad didn't, my parents were divorced, so I didn't spend a lot of time with my dad, so I didn't actually get to spend my youth growing up in aircraft, but I did get a chance to fly with him a few times in the early 80s. My journey really in flying started probably in the early 90s, and I actually traded a computer for an ultralight, and I flew that thing out of Paso Robles for probably a year or two. This was back before all the vineyards and everything were everywhere, so we could ground skim and fly around low altitude and not really have to worry too much about landing, because you could chop the power and land anywhere.
So how old were you when you started flying ultralights?
Oh, I was probably 20, 21.
Oh, okay.
Young enough to be dumb, I suppose, but smart enough to get away with most things. But I really didn't love flying with the engine. I mean, I enjoyed the flying. It was fun, but I found myself out there on on a couple of cloud-filled prefrontal days with the thing pulled back to idle, and trying to thermal this ultralight that honestly had probably a 600 foot per minute sink rate with the engine off. And at the same time, I was flying remote control gliders a bunch. And one day in probably spring of 1992, I was flying my remote control glider on a hill in Cayucas, and this crazy dude ran off the hill and flew over the top of me in a hang glider. And over the next few months, I got to know the local pilots, and that really piqued my interest. And eventually, I did some training with them. A couple of guys, Charlie Benoit and Trevor Kurth, were kind of instrumental into getting me into flying hang gliders, and really ran with that for about 17 years. Cut my teeth in cross country flying out of the Cuyama Valley, a site called Plowshare Peak. Lots of flying in the Owens in the summer times, trips up to Canada and Washington. So pretty good cross country experience. Flights in excess of 170 miles. I had a pretty good foundation for soaring when I decided I was ready for a different challenge or something a little different. And in 2008, took a demo flight.
Did your ankles and knees and everything make it in one piece through all those years?
For the most part, I have I had surgery on my knee from a blown meniscus. Landing downwind with an 80-pound hang glider on your back can beat you up. But for the most part, I was relatively injury free, other than the knee. But all of us had close calls, or I remember landing downwind once and on short final, seeing my GPS indicating 28 miles an hour over the ground, and I was like, "Oh, this isn't going to end well."
No.
So, but really, all of my early soaring started in hang gliders.
Yeah, we had a hang glider pilot on just a couple of episodes ago, and yeah, you'd be surprised how many glider pilots were flying RC, such as myself. I was flying RC gliders for, I don't know, 15 years or something, and then I just got tired of looking at this little plastic guy in the cockpit, and I thought, well, why not me? Why does it have to be you every day, right?
Exactly.
So
yeah.
So 2008.
Yeah, 2008. Went out to Avenal and took a demo flight in a 233, which wasn't what I was there to fly. I mean, I knew that I had to go through the training process, but I was enamored with glass ships, not with 233s. Nonetheless, hopped in it. I think got off tow and climbed about 5,000 feet in a thermal, and realized, yep, I can do this, but man, I have to do something with my feet instead of just point my toes all of a sudden. So decided that that was something I wanted to try, and I think my wife Julie and she took a demo flight that day as well, and I think we were out at Avenal every weekend for like the next 2.5 months straight. Didn't miss a Saturday, and soloed in 10 flights, whatever the minimum was, essentially, to have gone through the basics. And then took my check ride in January of 2009, and then we pretty shortly thereafter hopped on a plane to New Zealand and spent 3 weeks in New Zealand, and spent about 4 days in Amarama flying with Gavin Wills.
Oh man!
So that kind of lit a fire. I realized, man, this whole 2-seat flying is pretty awesome, and the duodiscus is great. And I let my friend Todd Robinson and Rex Mays know that, hey, if you ever see a good deal on a 2-seater, let me know. And like 3 months later, they called me. Todd calls me and says, hey, we got a duo that just came in. It's pretty rough, but you might be interested in. And my thought was like, when I said if you ever, I kind of meant like in a year or two, not like right now. So, but I managed to, I figured out how to fund it and made an offer on Five Hotel and bought that in December of 2009. So not even a year after getting my license. We picked up a duodiscus, and it was in pretty rough shape. The wings were really, really crazed, but good solid bones and a great flying airplane. Started flying that pretty extensively. I had an ASW 20 that I was a partner in.
So I'm curious, actually, on your crazed wings. What did you do to mitigate that at the time? Did you take it down and do like a PU, like a poly paint job, or just do like a cut and buff and just kind of live with it, or how did you deal with that?
Well, so since I had spent everything I possibly could, actually, all the money that I'd saved to remodel our kitchen, and I couldn't come up with a decent design, turned into an airplane, which honestly was the best money I could have, best thing I could have done with that money at the time. So we didn't really have any money to refinish the wings. I think that was the reason the people that owned it were selling it, is they didn't like, a $40,000 price tag for a complete refinish.
Yeah.
So I got it back and I went after it with sandpaper,
Yeah.
800 grit to start with. The crazing was so bad, it felt about like running your hands over a cheese grater. I mean, it was literally sharp, and you could feel it scrape on the palms of your hands when you ran them across the wing. So did some 800 for hours and hours, and then 1,000, and then 1,200, and then cut and polish from there. And it actually looked pretty good, with a heavy wax job.
Right.
It smoothed out.
Yeah.
I just had to go through that basically every year for the next 5 or 6 years, because any moisture that got into the trailer, it would cause the little crazing edges to lift, and you'd notice in spring that your wings were starting to feel pretty rough. Interestingly enough, it really didn't seem to impact the way it flew. Prior to a contest one year, I went out one morning and I wet sanded one wing because it was practice day and I only had time to do one before, getting the meetings going. So I wet sanded one wing, got it perfectly smooth. The other wing was completely rough and terrible feeling. I thought for sure there'd be a turn or some kind of a tendency that you'd notice. Couldn't tell at all. Airplane flew fine.
Yeah, I'm dealing with kind of a crazing situation as well, but just kind of living with it. Pretty much the same approach that you took.
Yep, keep it waxed. Eventually, I did have my buddy Todd refinish it, and he spent about 450 hours probably between most of that. Most of that ends up being sanding. Either sanding it off or sanding and polishing the new polyurethane that went on it. But it came out looking like sheet glass when he finished it, and it's beautiful. Still flies great.
Now,
the only downside.
You also fly powered, right?
Yeah. So I didn't pick up my power license until 2014. I was working up in the Bay Area, living on the Central Coast, and really hating the occasional 3.5 hour drive. So I thought, why not add my power ticket and commute sometimes in a power plane? So I was actually able to basically borrow a share of a Cessna 150 from one of our club members, Frank Owen. And I think Zach may have mentioned him on a previous podcast, but he loaned me his share of his Cessna 150 while he was out of the country, and I had 90 days to get my power ticket done.
That's awesome.
Got that taken care of, and then later in 2014 purchased a Glass Air 2 RG, which is a fairly quick 2-seat experimental retractable landing gear, 200 horsepower. Great commuter airplane, cruises pretty happily at about 175 knots.
Yeah, that's a really cool. That's a really cool plane, and it's definitely a lot easier than than the drive out to Avenal. And I guess, yeah, sticking with Avenal for a second. So can you just talk a little bit about just about the airport and the club and kind of the surrounding soaring conditions and just like where it physically is for our sort of non-US listeners?
Sure. So you and I are based in California, which is a pretty big state, and the Central California where I live over on the coast on the Pacific. Um, Avenal is about 100 kilometers, 60 miles inland from the ocean on the western side of the Central Valley. So it's south of Fresno by about an hour, and it's north of Paso Robles, California by about an hour. And uh, what makes Avenal pretty special from a flying perspective is that it sits just on the eastern side of a coastal convergence. So we have marine air that flows down the Salinas Valley. It gets sort of trapped by the mountains, and on the eastern side of that, we have kind of a typical northerly flow that flows down the San Joaquin Valley. And where those two air masses interact, we get a very consistent and strong convergence line. Mostly presents as stronger thermals to higher altitude, but it gives us a nice predictable highway essentially. And so we turn a lot of flights out of Avenal that are much farther and much faster than you would typically think for 5,000 or 6,000 foot AGL types of thermals. Just because the convergence line really adds a lot of energy into the system. So the club itself is usually between like 40 and 60 members. It has a handful of training gliders, a few instructors. Um, we use a Cessna 150 as a tow plane. It's 150 horsepower, but it gets the job done since we're only at about 800 feet MSL. And luckily, there's aside from power lines off the end of the runway, there's nothing to hit. You've been there, and pretty much if you close your eyes and just hold the stick still, you can land in almost any direction if you needed to in an emergency. So it's pretty friendly in that regard. And then the mountains are relatively close. They're about 3,000 feet higher than the valley where the airport's located. So they give us some unique conditions as far as they help line up the convergence, which is our primary weather mechanism that we leverage. But during southwest and westerly flow, we can also get wave off of them, which kind of leads towards the flight that we'll talk about in a little bit.
Aerox, the #1 in portable and engineered aviation oxygen systems, your source for FAA-approved oxygen masks and portable oxygen systems, and now introducing the Aerox Pro 2 Plus Flight Bag portable oxygen system. Small, lightweight, and simple to use, the Pro 2 Plus is perfect for the occasional user who wants the flexibility to access higher altitudes without worry about flying impaired. Now available at Aerox distributors and at Aerox.com. So remember, our friends at Aerox, engineered for aviators.
Yeah, I remember my first flight out of there. It was kind of slow going. The convergence was that, I don't know, 7,000-8,000 feet or something, but the mountains had enough kind of thermal activity that you could just kind of ratchet your way up slowly. And once things started waking up, and then then engage with the convergence. And once you're in the convergence, then you can just kind of go forever. And that day it was kind of both kind of north and south, or I guess southeast and northwest, because the mountains kind of line up that way. But yeah, and then as far as the just the land outs, and the valley's just got just tons of fallow fields, and like you said, you almost close your eyes and you'd probably land and be fine, and the glider is fine, which is another really cool thing about people that are kind of new to cross country that want to push out but not freak out about where they're landing. necessarily. And there's a lot of paved strips as well. So that is really unique in that way.
Yeah, you rarely have to go more than about 20 miles between either paved strips or duster strips. So something that you're happy. Since I primarily fly a duo, that's a 20-meter ship. It's kind of nice to have plenty of room. You don't want to have to be, landing on anything particularly narrow or with fences or obstacles on the sides, because you've got
Right.
65 feet of wingspan to deal with. And but we've
Yeah.
got quite a few options within, like I said, typically they're spaced about 15 miles apart, for what I would consider to be very good usable landouts that are in a database. You don't have to worry too much about whether or not there's going to be farm equipment on it or something like that. And then if you need it, you've really got tons and tons of cultivated fields that are perfectly safe to land in if you have to. I think I've only landed off airport twice in the last 13 years of flying out of here, and it's not for not. I mean, I've certainly put myself in positions where I was close to having to land out, but the fact of the matter is there's enough airports so that you don't really have to risk the damaging the glider or
Right.
from an unseen ground squirrel hole or something like that.
Yeah. So, all right. So as we kind of move through, we're going to do a couple setup questions before we get into your wave flight, and so apart from that flight, if you had to pick one flight that for whatever reason stands out in your memory banks, what would that be? And just tell us a little bit about that day.
I think the ones that stick out in my mind are actually the ones that end up not being that spectacular of a flight, but they end up being more memorable because of the amount of struggle or something they feel. A few years back, probably 8 now, I was flying with Ethan Ronat. He was in the back seat of the duo, and I had been trying to capture the egg, which is a Pacific Soaring Council trophy that goes from airport to airport, depending on who captures it. And it was in air sailing, which is north of Reno, Nevada. And so I'd been trying to find a way to capture it from Avenal. And I had a ground crew lined up, and we were going to give it a shot. So we were going to go what we call around the horn, which is to go south to the Tehachapis, across the Tehachapis to the Sierras, and then north on the Sierras. So Ethan and I, Ethan was game, and got him in the back seat. We were set up to go and headed south, and it just wasn't quite the right day. Things weren't working. We were in California Valley. We're at 1,000 feet AGL. Going, oh, well, maybe we're going to be landing down here. This is inconvenient. And then, dug a thermal out there and crossed over to the Tehachapis, and they weren't working. And then crossed back towards Taft, and I think we were probably down again to 1,000 AGL, and only a few miles from the airport. And because of the way the hills are set up, couldn't see the runway. So I wasn't willing to push up this. It's not quite fair to call it a canyon because it's more of a gully, but it's only a couple 100-foot high hills on the sides. But you're 3 miles away according to the GPS, and you literally can't see the airport, and you're like, something's not right. I'm not flying up this canyon, not being able to see that. I'll just go land in a field back a few miles. I just didn't trust my glide computer, basically, and so I turned around and I stumbled into a 3-knot climb. It's like, okay, great, climb up. I think we climbed 200 feet, and then there was the airport right there.
Yeah, I mean, the trust in the flight computer thing for relative newbie like myself that only has a couple of significant kind of out of the final glide of your home airport type of flights. That is a challenge for glider pilots a little bit earlier in their cross country career, just that sight picture of, wow, that looks really low and really far, and lo and behold, most of the time, yeah, you get back and you're like way over um,
Exactly.
pattern altitude, and it just, but it really does take. I mean, for some people, I don't know, like Zach, it just it feels like, for that guy, it was just always it's always clicked. But I'm like pretty conservative, nervous Nelly type person, and it's a little bit harder to to trust the numbers, especially like when you hit a big patch of sink, or like down here in the desert. You do get patches where you can be on the wrong side of a shear line, or something, and things get interesting. But it always kind of works out. But it's just hard to get your I think it's just hard to get your brain around that early days when you're first doing it.
Absolutely. And even the 30-to-1 glide, which is reasonably conservative in a ship that can do 45 and still air, um, is really flat and really uncomfortable. You look at a 30-to-1 glide to something that's 20 or 30 miles away when you're uh, at the kind of altitudes that we're flying around here, and it looks impossibly flat, and it's not even maximum glide for the glider. So you throw a few obstacles, a little bit of a hill that you have to fly over, and when I say the glide computer said we could make it, I mean it said we could make it with a couple 100 feet over a pattern altitude, but it just didn't feel right, and I wasn't willing to push into this unknown kind of a situation where we were going to go from, we've got safe fields behind us, to, man, I just walked us into a place where there's nowhere level to land.
Mm-hmm.
So, definitely, I definitely understand and can jive with the chicken aspect. I'm not nearly as bold as a lot of people. uh, so we got up there, and to just try to close out this little story, we got up maybe to 4,000 feet, so not real high. Crossed over to the Tembler Range, which is the mountain range it's on the eastern side of the San Andreas Fault, um, and we had kind of northeasterly winds, 10 to 15 miles an hour, not real strong. And I ridge soared for the next probably 15 miles, um, back to the north, headed back towards Avenal, until we got to the Highway 58 pass. So there's a highway that comes through a little notch, and that notch creates just enough of a vent for the marine air to push through. And sure enough, there was a nice eddy of marine air that was filling in, that
Right.
triggered a conversion thermal, and got a nice climb there to 6 or 7 thousand feet, which got us to the next pass, which is Highway 40, 46, and 41. Um, got another thermal behind Orchard Peak there, and then had final glide back to Alvanal, and it was one of those things that, as far as our goal, we were it was a complete failure. There was like, we didn't even get a third of the way to Reno. But you asked for like a memorable flight, and that one sticks out because it was just such a struggle. I mean, we were down to within hundreds of feet of the ground at times. I mean, in this case, it was only because we were ridge soaring. We weren't thermaling that low.
It's like
But
the win within the loss, basically, right?
yeah, yeah, but in the end, you're just like, that was great, And meanwhile, you can have a 600 or 700K flight with no
Right.
stressful moments or whatever else, and it just kind of disappears into the
But,
background.
but the beers taste good on those days too, right? So
Yeah,
so
I,
transitioning a little bit, so that was memorable. Let's go to what's the most concerning or sketchy moments or slice of time that you can remember in a glider, if you had to just pick one. So that could be a tow on launch. It could be, it could be a landing, could be rotor, like just kind of anything that just where you were kind of like, oh shit, like, this isn't particularly good right now.
I would say that this wave flight over to the Sierras had that moment for me.
Okay.
I've
Well,
experienced rotor out of Minden. I've experienced rotor in other places, but to have the thought of, is this aircraft going to stay together? Going through your brain, that was sort of a new one.
okay. Well, we'll get there. So we'll rip through a couple more setup questions, and then we'll dive into the flight.
Wings and Wheels has been serving the soaring and sport aviation community for over 30 years. They hands down have the largest and most comprehensive inventory of sailplane and soaring supplies in North America, and they ship globally. Nearly everything you'll find on their site is in stock and ready for same-day shipping. Wings and Wheels is the exclusive American representative for HPH sailplanes. Be sure to check out the Twin Shark, their latest launch. They're also now the exclusive distributor in North America for the new Just Soaring Glider Sim Pro. The team has thousands of hours of flying experience in gliders and airplanes. Staffed by Adam, Kelly, Julie, and Sean. A friendly voice will answer when you call or email them. Check them out at wingsandwheels.com.
What's the coolest or strangest thing you've ever seen from the cockpit of either your glider or powered plane or a hang glider in your case? And I suppose RC if you had a camera hooked up there, but probably back in those days you didn't. And you're in a safe space here, so if you want to talk about UFOs, it's fine.
I don't think I've seen a UFO yet. I, it'd be kind of cool, but that hasn't happened. So, I've had a variety of interesting experiences in basically all aircraft, but I think one that did pop into my head as you started asking that question is taking off in a t-shirt from Plowshare Peak after watching 3 people sink out. So this is in a hang glider. This is probably in the mid 90s. It was like 100 degrees. It was just blistering hot, and everybody was launching and sinking out. And so I didn't really dress for the day. I punched off, found a climb, and probably within half an hour, I was at 13 or 14,000 feet. And so I'm flying downrange, and there was a bit of a convergence that day, and I ended up under a shelf at 14,000 feet, and my arms and the leading edges of my down tubes and my base tube were covered in snow because it had been snowing for about the last 15 minutes under that. So, the surefire way to ensure you get high in a hang glider is to not wear enough clothing or don't take oxygen or, whatever will make you the most uncomfortable seems to contribute to a good flight.
That's yeah. Well, that is memorable, and you weren't wearing gloves or anything, so you're just basically all your extremities are freezing, and you're kind of like, okay, well this was fun, but I should probably burn some altitude now and warm up.
Yeah, thankfully, or not thankfully, the day giveth and and it taketh, and it wasn't too long, and I was back down in the sweltering heat, kind of wishing I was high and cool again.
All right, so a little bit of an abrupt segue. This is kind of like sports to weather on the local news. Sometimes it's a little awkward. Let's go to avionics. What flight computer setup do you have in your glider, and what do you like about it, and what do you wish it did better or differently if you had sort of a short wish list?
So for a lot of, I'll kind of split this one because for a lot of years I flew with the flight computer that was in the Duo, which is an old Cambridge LNAV, and I flew with XCSOAR on some form of Android device or even old Windows CE devices initially, and it's a really good combo if that's what you can afford and that works in your cockpit. It doesn't take the latest and greatest. That said, we upgraded my wife's glider, which is a Discus A, to an LX 9000 a couple of years ago, and I absolutely love it. It took a little bit of work to get my brain around sort of some of the logic and the way it's set up, or how you have to think. And I know, people sometimes struggle with that. Um, but I really do find that all of the information I want is available. It's not, I'm able to lay it out in such a way that it's not redundant. Um, so I can keep the information boxes to just the bare minimums for what I need. It's, for better or worse, infinitely configurable. And it's just really nice having everything in the glider. All you do is power up the battery. You can connect it to your phone over Wi-Fi.
Mhm.
Um, Download SkySight. Get your weather information loaded into it for weather layers, any kind of updates. So I'm really happy with the LX equipment. I'm in the process right now of upgrading the Duo to dual LX 9070s. So it'll have a 9070 front and rear. So I guess it'll make a great training cockpit for those people who want to, trying to get used to
Nice.
the LX series of equipment. Um,
So on the weather integration, do you pull that down in the morning, and it's just like an offline file that is predictive, and it just kind of rolls through each hour, and it's yeah, how does that work, I guess?
yeah, exactly. So so you're able to connect to your SkySight account, and then the way the LX is set up is a little bit clunky. You don't unfortunately you can't just say select the 10 layers that you want out of SkySight or whatever
Mhm.
the number is. You actually have to have a page that has that particular weather layer on it in your configuration. So I have a bunch of duplicate pages set up because the things I'm mostly interested in are convergence and uh, wave. Like,
Mhm.
cloud base. I mean, look out the window, you'll see what the cloud base is, right? Thermal heights kind of doesn't matter. It is what it is. So, things that may make more sense in flatland flying or something like that just aren't as applicable for me. But I do like having um, things like the convergence map or the vertical velocities at, let's say, 7,000, 10,000, and 16,000 or 13,000 and 16,000, so that if you are hunting for it, you have some guidelines as to where it'll be. um, so it's a little funky. You do have to set up these pages in advance in order to have the LX cache those
Mhm.
when you connect it to Wi-Fi. But then once it's cached, it's available throughout the day, and you can configure it to display, the current forecast for the whatever the nearest time slice is. So I think they're half-hour time slices. So if it's 12:30, you'll see the 12:30 convergence, for example.
Yeah, I
Or
mean that's infinitely useful, though. I mean, as opposed to not having weather integrated into your flight computer, and you're really just kind of going off of memory. I mean, you could you can click through the hours, and you kind of have a general idea, but it's pretty nice to have that overlay on your screen. Especially like wave and convergence stuff, because those little nuances, and plus you just get a little foggy and sort of forget, which is kind of what I'm doing now, because I'm I've got like the new Udi N, so, and it doesn't, it has SkySight when you're connected to the internet, but then, well, you're not connected to the internet when you're at 8,000 feet,
exactly.
in distance, right? So you're just going off kind of your memory from the night before, or the morning before you launch or whatever. So that is super cool. Um, and if I could back up just a sec, so your wife also flies gliders, and memory says she's also a tow pilot. So I think a lot of listeners are going to start to have a lot of envy right now. So your wife's a tow pilot and a glider pilot.
Correct. And she lets me fly both her Discus and her Citabria, so it works out pretty well for me.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of jealous pilots. out there. That's a pretty cool thing. You guys can kind of share together.
Yeah,
Um,
it's pretty lucky. She wasn't a pilot when we met. I was just a hang glider pilot back then, but she she took a demo flight the same day I took a demo flight at Avenal, and she's very competitive, and I think she didn't like the idea of me going off and doing something that
mhm.
she wasn't going to be a part of. And there was this 14-year-old kid who was flying that day solo in the 126, and I think she looked at
Yeah,
him and she was like, "Well, shit! If he can do this, I can do this." Um,
yeah, yeah,
and it ignited a passion that she just didn't know existed. Like so many people, probably especially women, they aren't introduced to the concept of, hey, you can be a pilot, right? So it was only in later in life that she discovered the passion for flying, and got her glider license, and then got her power
yeah.
license. She got her power license well before me, and then instrument rating, and um, so yeah, it works out. We can tow each other. We have we have the single seat discus. We have the duo. Um, the
Yep. Cool.
It would be a lie to say that flying as a couple is always easy. It can be very difficult. You have to learn to
Yeah. But
to
so it's
sep-
doing business
separate
together.
things in the cockpit.
There's I mean that just comes with the territory, right? But yeah, she retrieved me, which is another cool thing about Avenal. So I got a land out retrieve. This couple weeks ago, Zach just of course smoked me, and he was up in Convergence, and I was kind of scraping around. I think it was Coalinga, and it was all shaded, and nothing was happening, and she just popped over in the 150, and we hooked up, and then had another few hour flight after that. It's really cool. So all right, well let's dive into the big wave flight. And I guess for listeners that want to check it out on OLC, I guess they just search for Morgan Hall and it'll pop right up. Yeah.
Yeah, the flight was on April 16th of 2022.
Okay. And I've
So
got OLC up on my screen now. So maybe start with kind of like when how many days before did you see kind of conditions shaping up, and what was going to make this flight particularly challenging, and my memory says it was sort of a route that hadn't really been um, done before, in because I guess you started in wave over on the coastal side and then made it all the way out to the Owens Valley. Is that a correct assessment?
yeah, um, so the so a few days prior to that flight, maybe even almost a week, Kempton Azuno had shot me a text and had said, "Hey, looks like really good day coming up, next Tuesday or something like that." I don't remember what it was. So it kind of got me looking at the weather a bit more, coming into that weekend. And we had a number of fronts that came through, and they just sort of wobbled around, and they hit Northern California, or they didn't really hit us, and so the flight that Kempton and I had been talking about, just really wasn't lining up to happen. And but I kept an eye on Saturday because I saw some wave potential, and then the closer we got to the weekend, the more it looked like it was just going to be a good valley day with 6,000, 7,000 foot cloud base out in the valley. So kind of a typical post frontal thermal day, in the Central Valley in April or May. But what I noticed was the timing of the front seemed to be such that in the morning there was going to be kind of residual prefrontal winds. So at 8 a.m. I think is the earliest that SkySight shows, it looked like there was going to be wave, mostly on the Tembler Range, which is 40 miles or so southeast of Avenal. Um, and so it kind of opened up this possibility of, well, maybe we could launch early and get into wave. And initially my thinking was, let's just see if we can stay up on wave long enough for the thermals to kick off, and then, descend down into the boundary layer and have a thermal flight. Um, I've certainly gone the other direction plenty of times where you're flying thermals and then you find a little bit of wave and you climb up into it, and then you end the day in thermals again. But this was a scenario where it looked like relatively strong wave, 4 to 5 knots, all the way up to 18,000 feet. I'm kind of a notorious sort of late planner. Like, I kind of hem and haw, and I don't really make up my mind until pretty late. So I was kind of a jerk, and I didn't let Zach know early enough, that maybe I was thinking of doing something silly. And so I think it was like Friday morning, and I got up and I was like, asked Julie, I'm like, hey, can you tow me at dawn tomorrow at Avenal? And so
Yeah.
she was game for that.
Yes.
Just Soaring, the makers of the Glider Sim Pro sailplane simulator cockpit, would like to congratulate German pilot Ben Fest for his recent victory in the first ever FAI-sanctioned aviation esports event in history, the Sailplane World Grand Prix, which Ben won after several days of exciting competition against some of the top Condor soaring pilots from around the world. If you are looking for a best-in-class dedicated sailplane simulator cockpit for Condor or Microsoft Flight Sim, look no further than the Just Soaring Glider Sim Pro. Check them out at justsoaring.com or at just.soaring on Instagram.
Saturday flight, and Avenal usually only flies on Saturdays, so it's kind of a lottery ticket thing where you not only had kind of this perfect weather shaping up, but it also coincided with everybody's going to be out there, and tow off and all that kind of stuff, which made it even more more kind of special.
Yeah, there was a significant amount of serendipity involved. Although, by the time that I was sort of getting confirmation that she's willing to tow, we had a tow pilot scheduled for that day, but they weren't going to come out until later. And I don't really like to ask people to come out for, a dawn flight. It's a pain in the ass. And wave is also a little bit of a different scenario. You want to make sure that the tow pilots that you're asking, have flown in that. The rotor can be kind of snotty. You might be taking off with strong crosswinds. You might be dealing with, kind of interesting conditions on landing. There's a lot of question marks. So it's not the kind of thing you just throw out to anybody who maybe doesn't have a ton of tow experience. So having Julie available to tow, or someone like Dan Gudgel, who, is more than happy to get slapped around in the rotor, is usually kind of my go-to people when I'm thinking of an early flight. So I think it was
my check ride, by the way. He's a DPI, and sort of a local weather. He is a weather guru, isn't he?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
He worked for the National Weather Service out of Hanford for a number of years, and he doesn't necessarily need SkySight. Although after he enabled a little adventure for me earlier last year, or almost did, and I was like, "Do you have a SkySight subscription?" And he's like, "No, I should." And I was like, "Okay." I bought him a SkySight subscription because I was like, "Come on, man! Like, you might understand all this stuff, but most of us need pretty colors to look at." So it's helpful but it is really helpful to have somebody like that who understands, the dynamics, to a greater degree than I ever will, and can back up the pretty colors that I see in SkySight
on your LX. Yeah. So all right, well, let's kind of so I got OLC on my screen here, so maybe just just kind of take us on the flight there. So you launched it gee, what time was it? It's like 8 o'clock, 7 o'clock, something like that. Pretty darn
So
early.
yeah, it was around. So the plan was to launch around 7:30, um, and then get established in the wave. And if things felt really good, I my plan was to dive over the back from down near Taft and head out towards Cal City, where there was a wave bar predicted, and then use that to work my way into the Sierra wave. And what I was really gunning for in this kind of a flight was the first 1,000K flight out of Avenal. And Zach and I have been sort of beating on that one pretty hard for the last year or so, and it really looked possible. And then what I hoped was at the end of the day I could climb in wave near a waypoint called the Radar Site on the Tehachapi's, and then dive upwind back into the San Joaquin Valley and pick up some thermals at the end of the day, because it was supposed to be a good thermal day. So around 7:30, I took a tow, and between 7 a.m. and 7:30, the sky was closing in overhead. We'd had nice fawn gaps when we got up, before dawn, and the wave bars were visible. And by the time the tow plane was warmed up and we were on tow, it was starting to close up. I released at about 2,300 MSL, which is pretty low, but in solid 3 knots of lift, and it petered out at like 3,300, and I pretty much sank out like a rock after that. I had no luck finding any other rotor or any other workable lift. Landed back at the airport, got out of the way. I ran Zach's wing. He took a tow out to the east, trying to find a different wave bar in the clear air to work. And he was working that, and then I got loaded up for a second flight. So the second launch was at about 8:15 or something like that. So about 45 minutes later than I really wanted to be. And by then the sky had changed again, and we had some openings forming, and there was a fairly visible wave bar to the northwest in between Avenal and Coalinga. And so I think I got off tow in the 4,000 foot range, which is pretty high tow for, we often don't need that much of a tow, but I didn't feel like sinking out again. And then it was a bit of a slow climb, just a couple knots, nothing real fast. And the air was very wet. So it was raining over on the coast and Paso Robles and in San Luis Obispo. And, it wasn't like dangerous wet. We had large fawn gaps and plenty of visibility down and behind me, but it was wet enough that it's a little intimidating, because you can't always see like what's over the next lenticular, or what's over the next cloud bar. So I worked my way up to about 10,000 or so, and then started pushing to the south towards Taft, and jumped upwind a couple of wave bars over near Orchard Peak, and then connected with the Temblers, and that had a decent line on it with I don't think I ever saw more than like maybe 4 knots, but 4 knots at 9 in the morning is pretty damn good. And sure enough, it took me right up to about just under 18,000, a bit to
Yeah, I
the
mean, down
northwest
at
of
like
Taft.
Taft, you were what, about 5,500 meters or something. It looks like.
Yeah, so I was giving myself a few hundred feet of buffer. I think at that point I had dialed in the Bakersfield ATIS and got the Bakersfield altimeter setting, just to make sure I had, I could give myself as much room as legally possible. And then I think I had about 65 knot winds, so I dialed in Cal City as my next waypoint, which was, it's something like 75 nautical miles from Taft. And the wave bar that I was anticipating connecting with was a bit to the northwest of that. So I felt confident that if I had Cal City on a fat glide. That would give me time to explore the wave bar kind of near the Kelso Valley. Um, on the, I guess it's really the southern end of the Sierras. It's kind of near what is known as the Walker Plateau. It's in between Tehachapi and Inyokern.
Yeah, of course, you have
And
valley crossing, though, where I'm looking at kind of the altitude graph, and you lost like 2,000 meters going from Taft over to the east.
yeah, so it worked out. I think Zach looked at it. I ended up getting about 60 to 1 on that run. So it was a pretty easy glide with the tailwind, but I actually hit quite a bit more sink than I expected and not very much lift. So there were a few little wave bars in the valley, secondary or tertiary
Mhm.
that really didn't produce any lift, but they managed to produce some sink. Um, Tehachapi was capped in cloud, although it was fairly broken, so I could see like Tehachapi Muni, the paved runway there, and I can't remember if I could see the Skylark North, the glider port, but there were options, and then the whole valley itself was fairly broken as far as the cloud layer, so it wasn't like VFR on top or something really sketchy. It was basically just a fat downwind, float where you're pushing along at a little less than best glide for the most part, just trying to let the tailwind do the work for you. So I arrived at kind of the predicted area of lift at about 10,000 feet, which kept, that had me 8,000 feet above Cal City, which was only maybe 12 miles away at that point. So I was really in good shape there. I had lots of room to explore,
Mhm.
and had, as soon as I hit zero sync, I made I think I made a 90-degree left turn and then just let the wind blow me into the wave, and it was decent, like 3 knots of lift, I think, and right about 60 knots on the nose. So I pretty much just parked and went straight up, until I got high enough and brave enough to push a little farther to the to the north, up into Kelso Valley and up towards the Lake Isabella area there. Um, and then when that lift started to peter out, my next move was to dive downwind to Inyokern, and Inyokern really marks the end, or the southern tip of the quote real Sierra. So my expectation was that once I got there, that was where I was going to start finding the good climbs, and really be able to shift it into high gear and and, and cover some ground. Um, and it was a little weaker at Inyokern than what I sort of hoped. I haven't flown wave out of Inyokern before, so this was my first time into that particular portion of the Sierras in wave, and I think I probably ended up connecting in a secondary wave because I was pretty much over Highway 395. Um, and a lot of times it'll be closer to the mountains than that, but I didn't really go through anything closer, so no guarantees given the wind speeds. Um, and I started to press north, and pretty quickly I was butting up against the edge of the restricted area. I think it's 2505, and so I backtracked a little bit, called Joshua, approach to find out what the situation was for overflight of 2505, because it was going to make life a lot easier if I didn't have to steer clear of that. It takes a little bit of a corner, so you can often run up just right on the edge of the airspace, and then it turns and backs away and gives you some more room. Um,
So
but
they
Joshua,
put you through there a little, well, just that little corner, like Volcano Peak or whatever.
yeah, yeah. There's, you can. I was gonna be able to sneak around the edge of that, but I just felt a lot more comfortable if I needed to be in the restricted area, that it would be better to go back and double check. So I went back, got it to an area with stronger climb, and then called Joshua and found out that indeed, with with a squawk code and flight following,
Mhm.
I could enter 2505 above 10,000 feet.
And
So
that's where you're powered. That's kind of where your powered guy sort of comfortable with the radio and talking to air traffic control and all that stuff kind of comes in handy, I would assume also, right?
it definitely helps, being familiar with the ATC system and, knowing that they are there to help you. And um, it's beneficial. I mean, they're generally really pretty easy to work with. And so I just called them up for a VFR request, found out whether or not I could get in, took a few minutes to decide if I was going to go ahead and take the flight following, and then called them back and said, yeah, I'd like to go ahead
Yeah.
and get flight following. And they were like, well, where to? And I'm like, up to Bishop. And they're like, how high? And I'm like, as high as I can get, hopefully. So
Yeah.
got a squat code, and then that let me.
Please climb to 17,500. You're like, I'm in a glider, guys, but okay, I'll give that a rip.
Yeah, and so with a squat code, then I could enter the restricted area without having to worry about it. And I used that for my first leg to the north. And like I said, I was probably in the secondary bar, and it was working. It was working pretty well. It was working great in the up to about Alancha or so.
Our longtime sponsor of the show, the Soaring Academy, is engaged in nonprofit outreach work with local area veterans and also with young people for the STEM programs at their top-notch gliderport facility just outside of Los Angeles, nestled near the north side of the San Gabriel Mountains. They also have a fantastic flight school and are continuing to turn out great glider pilots every month. If you like to donate to their nonprofit initiatives or learn more about their flight school, go to soaringacademy.org or check them out on Instagram at Soaring Academy.
No, when you're in the Owens Valley on a wave day, I would imagine that, I mean, your flight computer says, okay, if you get into a jam, you could land here, here, and here, but then on the ground, my reckoning of that is that it's pretty sporty on the ground down there, right? So you're pretty much committed to like not really wanting to land out back there on wave days.
I definitely didn't want to find myself low in the Owens Valley. The runways are all aligned up and down the valley, sort of generally north south, or I guess probably more northwest southeast. And the rotor was touching down in Alancha on the southern end of the Owens Dry Lake, and so there were pretty massive dust walls of dust getting pulled up and out towards the Panamint Valley, which is out to the east. So it was clear that winds were snotty. I didn't check the AWAS at Lone Pine. That can be a useful thing. Just check and see what the winds are. That would have told me what surface winds were doing. I mean, but I didn't. I didn't get low enough to where I felt like that was necessary.
40 knots or something crazy down there.
What was that?
I said, what's your guess on what the winds would be doing down there if you got rotor touching down and dust walls and stuff?
I suspect it was probably 40 knots, maybe 50 knots in the Alancha area on the surface. I mean enough that it would be very unpleasant. If assuming you landed and got the glider on the ground, you'd probably be stuck in the glider with the dive brakes out and the stick pushed forward for the next day while you waited for somebody to come help you. Right. So I wouldn't say that landing wasn't an option, but it was definitely very far down my list of things that I wanted to be doing in the Owens Valley that day.
All right, so you're pushing north, and kind of keep going with that.
Yeah, so I'd got up into the 17.5 range, and was running along at probably 110 knots indicated. And around the north end of Alancha, if you kind of look at the Sierras, you'll see there's kind of a point that juts out right there south of of lone pine, and then the Sierras kind of make a little bit of a directional change, and that's really where the big stuff starts. You're getting into 14,000 foot peaks up into the Mount Whitney area, and it's kind of a dramatic change from the mountains down closer to Alancha, which are, the peaks are at, for the most part, 10,000 maybe, and pretty even. So they get a lot more jagged when you get up into the big portion of the Sierras. And I crossed through an area of, it's sink, but nothing really terrible. And then it bumped up to maybe 20 knots down. So that's getting pretty bad. And
Knots down for the uninitiated that's what, like 2,000 feet per minute down.
2,000, yeah, 2,000, 2,100 feet per minute.
That's pretty insane.
Yeah, it was.
Your altimeter is just winding down, and you're kind of like, oh shit.
Yeah, it's definitely, that you've hit you're not in the right air any longer. And generally what you need to do is push upwind. All else being equal, you want to hunt upwind first, because with 60, 65 knots on the nose, going downwind, things go really fast, and going upwind takes a lot more time and energy. And somewhere in the, 13,000 foot range. So I'd lost probably 14,000, or I'd gone down from 17.5 down to, the 13 ish. And I hit just absolutely violent rotor, like, everything from every pocket of the glider flies out of it. I was cinched down pretty tight, so I didn't go anywhere. My feet, kicked the underside of the panel and came off the pedals. And so at that point I slowed down a bit, knowing that I was in for a bit of a ride. And then, then the washing machine, or I think Zach calls it the Whitney Rodeo, started. And, I would call it severe turbulence. I mean, it was 45 to 90 degree uncommanded rolls, to where you're
sorry, what was that again? 45 to what?
To 90 degree, uncommanded roll, meaning I didn't tell the glider to do it, and I went from a 45 degree left bank to a 45 degree right bank, or something like that.
Holy crap!
And you're going through shears that are probably 50 knots, and from 50 knots from one direction, and then 50 knots from the other direction, and you're getting blasted, and the glider's making noises, and you can go from nearly stalled to nearly redline in a matter of seconds.
So this is about the time you're briefing yourself on your sort of ejection protocol, and reminding yourself where your D-ring is, and like,
yeah,
you're definitely concerned at this point.
Right. There was a moment there where it was like, okay, this isn't good. And of course, during this, you're trying to figure out, well, wait a minute, where do I need to be to get back into the smooth air? Because this sucks, and I don't want to do this anymore. And so, if you look at the trace, it felt forever, but it was probably only a couple of minutes. And I worked around near a couple of rotor queue that popped up. And the mistake I made was I just didn't push too close enough to the mountains. And so, I was doing some circles in the rotor, getting thrashed really hard. And one of the deceptive things about that portion of the Owens is that you are up next to some absolutely gigantic mountains. You have approximately 10,000 feet of vertical relief from the peaks to the valley floor. And so when you're sitting there staring at Mount Langley, or, one of the mountains that's right out in front of you, even though you're 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 miles away, it absolutely just fills your entire view. There's nothing but mountain in front of you. So it's very deceptive as far as how close you are to the mountains, or how far away you are. And I just didn't read the air right, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
I probably should push closer, but maybe I'm in the rotor that, maybe I'm still in the portion that's spilling over, and the actual lift is behind me. Um, and so I made a few attempts a little bit farther downwind, still in the rotor, and I had one turn where I was banked up at probably 50 degrees of bank, probably 75 knots, and it rolled me to 45-degree bank in the opposite direction. So I was in a left turn, and it rolled me to a 45-degree right bank, and then pitched me over to the point where the only thing in my field of view was ground. So I was probably something like 70 degrees nose down. Of course, it feels like you're upside down at that point, but in reality, it was probably like a 70-degree nose down, and no sound of airspeed. Uh,
Wow.
you wiggle the controls, and like there's no, there's no air flowing over any of the control surfaces. And I recovered from that, and I was like, fuck this, I'm out. And I think I was at 12 or 13,000 feet at that point, and I headed back towards Alancha, and I figured I'd go collect my
So
wits.
that was up. What is it on the OLC? It's Timos Peak or something. That is that. Wait, no, it's up. Oh, by Lone Pine. That's where you kind of bugged out, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's
Uh,
south. I was probably
I-
almost due south of
yeah.
of Lone
Okay.
Pine,
I see it
and
now on the
there's
trip. So, yeah, yeah. And Whitney's
so
huge. 4,400-meter peak. And so then and so like you saw the light and God was talking to you, and it was kind of like, well, this is probably a good time to turn back down the valley and try to get back home.
well, I just was regrouping at that point. Like I didn't I didn't have I didn't really feel like blowing up the glider, and exploring skydiving. And that's really the only time I've felt like that in a glider. I've been thrown around before, and I wouldn't say lost control, but I've had times when the control surfaces are simply not enough to counteract what the air is doing. But this was the first time that the glider was making noises.
Well, but
And,
for a
and
hang glider pilot, I mean, come on, ejecting at 10,000 feet and wave. I mean, that would probably be pretty exhilarating, right?
yeah, I got most of that exhilaration out when I was younger. I was perfectly
Yeah.
okay with a more benign flight. Um, so yeah, I was like, yeah, this isn't worth 1,000 K is not worth dying over, or getting dragged across the desert, or destroying my wife's glider, or any number of things. So
Mhm.
I headed back towards Alancha, and I reconnected in the wave. But then as soon as I got back up to Lake 17, I was like, well, maybe it won't be that bad if I go try again. and and so I turned around, and by now I've wasted 10 or 15 miles, and I turn around and I fly back up, and I got up into the same area, and I didn't get into as bad a rotor, but I started getting into the rotor again, and I just was like,
Mhm.
nope, I'm not doing this. Um,
Yeah.
and I mean, that was a mistake. I didn't think my way through the problem and be like, okay, wait, what's going on here? Like the mountain range direction has changed. The wave is going to be spilling over in a different way. I'm going to have to punch upwind 2 more miles than I have. So of course I tried the same thing and I had the same experience. It wasn't really shocking. But in the moment, dealing with the adrenaline and everything else, I was like, that's okay. I don't need to do this. So I turned and I ran south. The Monty Python run away moment. Um, and and
Uh,
so I ran down. I had a really uneventful run to the south, other than you know almost just getting into smooth, strong lift to the point where you're running up on VNE, um, and
which
and still climbing.
that kind of fast forwards us to, okay, so you're high and good, and you get back down the valley, and now you're kind of looking at your watch, and it's like, okay, I need to start getting back, to Avenal, and it looks like, see, where are you? So
So I
Well,
made I made
altitude.
2 laps. I essentially made 2 laps in the Sierra between Inyo Kern and Lone Pine. So, I had my fun in the rotor. I ran south past Inyo Kern a little ways. I turned around and I ran back north. Um, got into the rotor again, turned around, and then started my run south. I mean, I knew I didn't have OLC legs to go 1,000K, or so I thought. And so my plan at that point was like, well, let's just see if this whole thermal home in the afternoon works. Um, so it was pretty early still. It was probably on that second run to the south. It was probably, 2 o'clock.
Yeah,
Obviously, the data is there, so we don't have to wonder. But just off of memory,
yeah,
and it was a really easy run um, all the way down past Tehachapi. I mean, there was lift available. It was right where it was predicted. It wasn't real
yeah.
strong, so I wasn't able to fly very fast. I was just kind of cruising along at 70, 80 knots or something like that, until I got down to the radar site, which for those people who aren't familiar with the area, it's called a radar site, not because of being used for radar, but they actually test aircraft there for their radar signatures. So like stealth aircraft, things like that, they put them up on pedestals and fire radar beams at them and see how they look. So it's a testing facility.
Then once you
Now,
get on to the kind of the east side of the southern portion of the Sierra, I'm looking here. Then you go from like 5,000 meters to 2,000 meters, and just like you're coming up to Bakersfield, and at this point you're just dropping into the valley, and then you're starting to look for just thermal stuff at that point, right?
yeah, so that portion was actually really spectacular, as far as the flight was concerned, because there were these really nice puffy cumulus clouds, probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 thousand feet of vertical development on them. So just your perfect cotton ball, but you're coming down from 17,000 feet, so I was 5, 6 thousand feet above the tops of them, and then kind of weaving between them as I worked my way up towards the north side of Bakersfield. So it was almost like a flying dream where you're just kind of carving your way through these canyons of the clouds. Um, they were pretty nicely spaced and everything, but I mean it took a while before I got down below cloud base, which was only at about maybe 6,000 feet. Um, and I took sort of a northerly path there because with the westerly flow, I've had several flights around that area where the ridge line works really well on the western slope of the Sierra if you can get into it, and you can run for about 70 nautical miles up along the mountains, with very little circling a lot of times, just partially ridge lift, partially thermals, all the way up until almost near Reedley, kind of south of or the east of Fresno. So at this point, I knew that I was actually OLC wise going to be only about 20 miles or 40 kilometers, 30 kilometers
Mm-hmm.
short of 1,000K. So, my OLC home display on the LX 9000 was showing me at, I have mine set in nautical miles. So I think it was showing me at like 516 nautical miles if I made it back to Avenal. And I needed 540 to get for 1,000K. Um, Always fun having to do the math from, one unit to another. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and so my option was like, well, if I run north, I can get past Fresno. That'll get me to 1,000K. And then I just got to try to dart across the valley. So I kind of took the northerly path around Bakersfield, but the westerly winds were so strong and the cloud base was so low that it really just wasn't safe to push up into the mountains as far as I would have liked to.
Yeah.
It's a long, flat glide out over, I wouldn't call it unlandable terrain, but it's terrain you wouldn't want to have to land in. It's kind of rolling hills. There's no flat spots. There's no fields. And you'd be dealing with, a 15 knot headwind in less than friendly terrain. So I wasn't able to push into the mountains though I wanted. So I kind of came off the foothills and headed out towards Delano. Um, and the only thing really that didn't go as planned that is for the day, aside from getting my ass kicked in rotor, was the thermals were just not as strong. I mean, I think at 4 o'clock the forecast had been for, I don't know, 4 knots to 7,000 feet or 7 knots to 6,000 feet. I mean, it was a pretty strong day, and it was like I was really happy to pick up 2 knots to 4,500 feet. So it turned into a real
On the way
slog.
to the airport, you got down to, what is it? It's showing 6. So what, about 2,000 AGL at like El Rico or something, and then you dug out some thermal there. But that was kind of as scratchy as you got, like on the
Yeah,
way.
it was fairly consistent. There were, but it was drying up really fast. So, as I descended from the flight levels down into the clouds, or into the thermal layer, there were these big, beautiful, puffy clouds. And by the time I got to around Delano, they were just little scraggly Q with just wispies and things like that. And the lift was just dying fast. And it wasn't actually even that late at that point. It was like maybe 4:30. Um, and so it really took me a long time to get across the valley. I mean,
Well,
it
and you're
was,
flying upwind too, right? I mean,
yeah,
yeah,
you're upwind, no, unballasted. So
yeah,
you're kind of battling it. You're losing ground every time you stop in thermal. Um,
right.
and yeah, there were a couple of low points there, like in between Delano and Corcoran. I think I got down into the 2,500 MSL range, and then found a climb and moved on and found another little climb, and then I got to near Westlake Farms, and there was a bit of a convergence line there that I got back up into the, I don't know, 6,000 feet, 5,500, 6,000, something like that. And at
And
that
then
point, I had to make a decision.
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, at that point, I had to make a decision because I had final glide to Avenal, but if I could get onto the hills north of Coalinga, I could get that extra 24 miles away from Avenal I needed to get 1,000K. So I'm looking at this little convergence line that heads up towards Coalinga, and I was like, okay, I'm going to follow. I'm going to take these clouds and go this route. I really only need 2 more thermals, and I can make this happen. And it didn't happen. So I got up north of Coalinga and found a little climb that petered out well below cloud base, and everything similar to what you experienced earlier in the day was shaded, and it
Just
was
shut down.
6:30
Yeah.
in the evening at that point, and I poked around as much as I could. Found a few little weak 1 knot climbs and stuff like that, but eventually just had to admit defeat and go land at Coalinga.
Or celebrate success.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was at the moment, in the moment it was defeat because I was so
1,000K,
focused on 1,000K.
right? But sort of, it's like success at a pretty high level. I mean, that's crazy, crazy flight.
Yeah, I mean, I've torn the flight apart in my head, out of all the different places I could have made a decision different, and got that extra 20 miles I needed to get to 1,000K, which is just a number, but it's a big one. And but the reality is it was it actually, I mean, I recognize it is a fairly groundbreaking flight because of the fact that it took off in wave, transitioned from one wave system to another, and then finished the day in thermals, which is it's just kind of an unusual set of circumstances that let that happen. And but I think what the best thing is that it really kind of opens the door. It's a psychological barrier of, we don't tend to jump wave systems this dramatically,
Yeah.
most of the time. So, you know, it's not going to take much. Somebody can pop out of Avenal, get into the wave, take that same line down towards Cal City. It's a real safe. It's in the grand scheme of things, it's a safe route. From 18,000 feet at Taft, you can easily make Cal City. Cal City's well aligned with the winds. When I was near Cal City, the winds were like 15 knots on the ground at Cal City, so they weren't bad, even though I was in 60 knots of wind at altitude. So, as long as you've got a crew and the willingness, it's a really viable route for getting established in the Sierra Wave. And at that point, you go do 1,000, 1,500 K if you just put the puzzle pieces together on the right day. So I think a bunch of people, we'll see this flight duplicated. Maybe not the thermal at the end of the day portion, because that part was really just a unique aspect of the weather. But certainly the jump to the Sierras it'll be the first of many. It'll be the first of many, I'm sure.
All right, so we're running a little long in time. Going to just fast forward to the end here. Just last couple wrap-up questions. So who are a few of the people or peers and mentors in the glider world that you look up to for their accomplishments in soaring, whether that's racing, wave flights, people you follow on social media, significant others,
Yeah, it's we're really fortunate that there are just a ton of people who are willing to share knowledge, and you may have met them, you may not have met them. We're in an area where we've got guys like Rami, we've got Darren Braun, Matt Gillis, people with just tremendous weather knowledge that they're sharing and helping each other out. I think flying with Gavin Wills down in New Zealand was huge. He's just a wonderful pilot and instructor to fly with. So it's really a lot of the peer group. It's the upcoming guys like Zach and Thomas Greenhill and others that are kind of keeping the energy going that sort of bring out the kid in all of us. So there's a ton of people. I'm not remembering all of them right now. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean the world's better definitely for the young guns that are trying to keep things going. But yeah, so thanks for sharing sharing your story and your adventures, and congratulations on a pretty groundbreaking or air breaking, I guess, because we're in the flight. And really appreciate you taking the time for us, and I bet a lot of people are gonna pick up some pieces here, learn some stuff, and get inspired to do their own epic flights in whatever degree or way that is.
Absolutely.
So really appreciate it, and thanks for coming on Soaring the Sky.
All right, thanks a lot, Mitch. Talk to you soon.
If you would like to say hi and let us know where you are enjoying the podcast, we would love to hear from you. If you are a glider pilot and want to share your aviation journey, contact us at chuck@soaringthesky.com or send us a message on our website at soaringthesky.com, and Chuck will get in touch with you. We hope you join us next time for another soaring adventure here on Soaring the Sky, a Glider Pilots podcast. Soaring the Sky is written and produced by Chuck Fulton, co-producer Mitch Thompson. Original music for the podcast was written and produced by Kim Spangler. Graphic design for the podcast was created by Zachary Fulton. Voiceover work was done by Michelle Perez.